Mahjabeen Dhala completed her MA with honors here at the GTU and is continuing as a presidential scholar in the PhD program in the Department of Sacred Texts and their interpretation. Her dissertation looks at the sermon of Fatima to trace early Shia activist voices, especially those of women. In her capacity as a religious speaker and a spiritual guide, she has traveled widely, thus gaining a unique insight into the concerns of Muslim women, both in the global north and the global south.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to see you all this morning. As you can see, my talk is going to be from a female Muslim perspective, and the title is 5 Foundational Women in the Qur'an, and proposing a rereading of their stories from the Shia female perspective. Now, my aim for going into this study, and especially picking these 5 women, is because they're very popular throughout the Abrahamic traditions, and it's going to be easier for me to just go to my conclusions from their narratives instead of just reading out their narratives to you. So I went into this study primarily to argue that Muslim women seek their agency and their role as human actors from their sacred text itself. The text is enabling women, authorizing women, and even inspiring women to create change and bring about social justice. So where does the oppression lie then for the Muslim woman? It lies majorly in the patriarchal interpretation of that text. And I make a case here based on the readings of Asma Barlas and Amina Wujud and Barbara Stowasser that for a large part of those interpretations being patriarchal is because of the heavy borrowing from the biblical traditions by the early exegetes. And they've made this whole case in their books, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with their work. One last point that I make in this study is that the Shia narrative is very marginalized, and it is the minority within the minority, and the literature doesn't really see the light of day, is less referenced, less cited, and I propose with this presentation to bring to you the fresh take that it gives on these narratives, and also a liberatory aspect in their stories, and perhaps to facilitate an understanding why modern Muslim women then choose piety and choose to live with piety and visible Muslim appearance in liberal countries and societies here in the West. So without further ado, I have this gadget here. I'm going to go to the first woman who I've chosen, and that can be nonetheless, it all starts with Eve. So it all starts with her, the mother of humankind, and of course the two notoriously infamous stereotypical characteristics that emerge from her story, and women are trying to wash that off till today. One is the common assertion that she was created from the rib of Adam, and somehow leading to being a second-class citizen, or just not able to do what a man can do. And secondly, the scandalous reputation that she is the one who started this, the initial sin. Yeah. Now, you're very familiar with it. What I'm trying to do is tell you that the creation of the Adam, creation from the rib of Adam is not sustained in the Qur'an anywhere. There is no single verse in the Qur'an that alludes to that. Nor is there any verse in the Qur'an that says Eve misled Adam and then they were taken out of their paradise where they were living in peace. I want to really share with you this one narrative from a Shia book, which was written by Sheikh Saduq, and it's a long name. And he talks about the creation of Eve. And this might be a fresher take on what you might have already heard about that narrative. So when people came to the 6th Imam of the Shiite 12 Imams following, his name is Ja'far, and they came and they said, people are talking about Eve being created from the rib of Adam. And what is your take on this theology, or on this theory? And he said that's a crazy theory, because what are you trying to say? That was God not able to create another creature? Or that Adam married his own body part? Is that what you're trying to say? So then he gives this narrative. He says, God the Most High created Adam from clay, and then he created Eve and placed her beside him. Adam asked her, "Who are you?" She replied, "A creation created by God, as you can see." Duh. Then Adam said, "Oh Lord, what a beautiful creation is this. Looking at her makes me yearn for her company," of course. God said, "Oh Adam, this is my servant Eve. Would you like to be with her? Would you like her to accompany you, talk to you, share your affairs?" And he says, "Oh yes, my Lord. I would praise you and be thankful to you as long as I remain." And then God married them. So Adam called her, "Come to me." She said, "No, you come to me." And Adam had to rise and move towards her. I find this a better narrative. This second part, which I'm going to say in context to that contemptuous theory, that she's the one, the root of all problem, the initial sin. Like I said, there is no verse in the Quran that would sustain that theory, but I found this prayer. Now this prayer itself is called the prayer of Dawood. So that's a prayer named after a woman. And this woman is someone whose son was confiscated or taken away by the government, the Abbasid Caliph, and she came to the 60 Imam and she said, they're going to kill him because he's a Shia. So he said, sit down, do some prayers, and recite this prayer. I'm talking about this prayer because this is recited annually in all Shia communities every year. They do it. In fact, they did it 2 weeks back in my community where I go to in San Jose. So it's become part of their rhetoric. That's how they pray to their Lord once a year, using this prayer. And in this prayer, this caption about Eve is so refreshing. It's so liberatory. It is not at all like the satanic temptress that she's made out to be. Look at this part. She's used as an intercessor for this prayer. "O God, send blessings upon our mother Eve, the one purified from every filth, the one cleansed from every dirt, the one favored among humankind." In fact, the Arabic word is also ins, as in humankind. "The frequently present among the stations of sanctity." So you see the 4 things here: the nobility as a mother, her pureness, cleansed from every kind of filth and dirt, her supremacy, she's preferred over all humankind, and of course her spiritual elevation, because she's so sacred, and because of her sanctity we use her as an intercessor in our prayers. So this gives us a very different picture of what she's made out to be. The second woman that I talked about, and I'm not going to go too much into this part because this is Hagar, as we call her in Arabic, or Hagar, as you may know her. And she is the pioneer of this important fundamental tenet of Islam, and that is the Hajj. And she's the one who established it. And all women and men who go for Hajj actually embody and emulate her actions. So she is the woman who is followed in this very important and intrinsic part of worship in Islam. Now, although there is no direct reference to her in the Quran, and most of her narrative is based or built around tradition, this verse in the Quran actually talks about her or alludes to her, because she is left into the desert with her infant child. Now, you know the story. I'm going to tell you what the story is not. It is not about female rivalry in a patriarchal home. It's not about that. Although it's very convenient to talk about her like that. And I'll tell you what it's not. It's not validation for men to run away from their spousal duties saying, Abraham did it. It's not about that. So the narrative is not about that. What is it about then? It is about God using a woman as her agent to establish the house that is going to be the direction toward which every faithful person is going to turn to in prayer. She's going to be the one who embodies the actions that every faithful will go and enact in her name. And if they don't do it once in a lifetime, then they will be falling short or missing in their duty as faithful believers. So that is her importance. To just very, very quickly summarize, I love this quote from Shariati. Ali Shariati, in his book Fatima is Fatima, has written this, and he's given this beautiful tribute to Hajar. He said, the God of Abraham chooses a woman from among this great humanity, or human society, as an unknown soldier, a mother, and a slave. In other words, God chose a creature who in all systems of humanity lacks nobility and honor. God orders Abraham to build the greatest house of worship for humanity, and alongside it, the grave of this woman. I don't know how many Muslims even realize it, that when they go for Hajj, they're actually circumambulating around the tomb of a woman. I don't even know if they realize that. These three women, I must talk about them, and I'll say within my time. The mother of Moses, you know the story. These are the verses in the Qur'an. She lives during the time of a tyrant who is killing infants, is slicing the stomachs of women so that he can get rid of this child who is afraid of. In that time, when she gives birth to a child, she hears a voice in her head saying, nurse him, put him in a box, throw him in the river. What is it called? The baby blues? Yes. These depressive thoughts that you have in your mind? Now, what does it take for a woman at her time? I mean, if you could just put yourself into her shoes for that part of the narrative. She hears this voice in her head. Nurse the baby, put him in a box, throw him in the river. First, this points out that God speaks to her. As a woman, she is qualified to receive revelation. Secondly, she is intellectually strong enough to discern the sound of the divine from a depressive thought. And thirdly, she doesn't passively rely just on God, she has an action as well. She tells the sister, follow that box. Follow that box. This I find very ingenious about her. The sister of Moses. So what did she do? She started following the box. Now, you know the story. But what I'd like to highlight here in the role of the sister, which just goes in the periphery somewhere, because there are no direct verses in the Quran about her contribution. But when I think about her, I don't know how old she was. So I don't know if she's a teenager, I don't know if she's a young adult, but I know she's a woman. And she is running after a casket or a box which is flowing in the river, but she is on foot. And I don't know what terrain she is running against. So this is talking about her physical stamina. So don't call women physically weak. This is her physical stamina, and she's running behind this box. Secondly, she infiltrates the Pharaoh's palace, and that's not something easy to do. She finds herself in a decision-making scene where they're wondering, what are we going to do with this baby? And she has the courage to say, I know what you can do. I know someone who can nurse this child. To me, all that takes a lot of courage. I mean, nothing less than a mission impossible. To infiltrate in there and then speak and rescue Moses. And sort of unite him with his mother. Become God's agent. God says, throw him into the water. I will make sure that I reunite you with your son again. And she becomes that agent who enacts God's plan. And of course, lastly, for this presentation, is the wife of the Pharaoh. And I couldn't talk. I mean, I could just go on about her, but I know when to stop. One of the beautiful things about her in the Quran is that she is presented as a role model for humankind, women and men, not just a role model for men. Allah draws an example for those who have faith, the wife of the Pharaoh, when she said, my Lord, build me a home near you in paradise and deliver me from the Pharaoh and his conduct and deliver me from the wrongdoing lot. What is this saying about the wife of the Pharaoh? She's the one who intervenes and protects the child who is the infant Moses. Very quickly from this verse, you can find out that she is not a material person, even though she's married to the richest trump of her time. She yearns the proximity of God. She wants a house in God's proximity. Speaks a lot to her spirituality. She exonerates herself from the actions of her spouse. She may be physically espoused with him, but through her conduct, she is divorced from what he does or chooses to do. And not only that, she denounces injustice everywhere, the wrongdoing lot. And then you know how the story goes, that when he wants to kill this child, the Pharaoh, she intervenes and she says two things here, which I want to bring out. And I argue that this is not just a woman, a disturbed woman with a desperate plea. No, this is a well-articulated proposal. Because simple emotional ramblings wouldn't go far with Pharaoh, because he's killed so many women and he's killed so many children that he's immune to that now. So her proposal had to be brave and it had to be well-articulated. There had to be something in there for him. Now Barbara Stowasser talks about the impotency of the Pharaoh. So she doesn't have a lot of spousal pleasure there, and the chances of him not having an heir. So when she puts her proposal, she said, maybe this child could be a comfort to you and me because you're not making me happy. And secondly, you're not going to have an heir. Perhaps we could take him as a son. He could serve that purpose to us too. And I think it was this well-articulation of her proposal that allowed Moses to live in the house of the very tyrant who had promised to kill him. So she becomes instrumental here. So these are the women that I chose to speak about. And very quickly, I'm just going to conclude with some of the points that I'm trying to make through this study. Of course, it was, as you can see, a feminist hermeneutical approach to the Qur'an from the perspective of women. But what I'm really trying to make here is a case for religious women, Muslim women, reading the foundational sources normatively. This is the case I'm trying to make here. And that is quite against the biblical hermeneutics. And this relates to the first point, is a critique of the Western feminism's secular bias and the abandonment of religion. So the Muslim feminist is not sharing that same insight. Now, this is where I'm going to talk about my position in this whole thing. And that's the last thing that I'm going to bother you with. Now, Islam is a complex tradition. Sunni and Shia, which is a minority within the minority, and it gets reduced to sound bites for mixed audiences due to political, in the political context. And as a scholar myself, I see the labor of Muslim women's scholarship goes unnoticed, being dismissed as not sufficiently critical of their own religion. And not sufficiently critical of their own patriarchy. But it misses our scholarly work in narrative poetics, in theory, in methodology, and all we are supposed to do is talk about politics and how we are fighting patriarchy rather than being assessed on our academic contributions. I would really like to see more Shia literature coming to light, being cited in academic work, and more of the scholarship being shared across traditions. So thank you so much for your time, and yeah, it was a pleasure. I'll be happy to take questions if you have.
I have a question about what is your plan to do in terms of Shia publications when you're done with your work here?
Well, I know that one project that would help the Shia literature a lot would be the translations of their works, especially their theories and methodologies into English. Being in the interdisciplinary seminar and also in the methods and theories course that I am as a doctoral student, I find it so heavily, predominantly Christian, And I find myself navigating through the terminology, having to translate everything that I've known as a body of science into a totally different language. So I think one of the very useful projects would be to have translations of the works, like right from the 10th century up to now, into English. And I think that would open up that body to access by a lot of researchers. I'm currently working on my dissertation, which is the Sermon of Fatima, and I'd really like to, present that piece as a verbal protest by a woman. So there's just a lot in narrative poetry. There's a lot in spiritual practices where women are leaders of those spiritual practices. The list is long.
Thank you. What other questions do we have?
I have a question. It's probably directed to all three of you. So I draw a distinction between theological, or in this case, THEA, theological studies, and religious studies, in that religious studies use certain methodologies, and some of you have used that in your presentation. And the distinction that I draw is in theological studies, we are sometimes talking about spiritual things which cannot really be quantified, right? And it seems to me that women in general, when they have to somehow subvert patriarchal traditions, they draw on various aspects of culture. But I think that as theological students, we need to keep in mind that it seems that they are also drawing on power, right? So what would you think is the most significant factor for women to basically transgress or to subvert patriarchy? I know you spoke about using women's voices and in reinterpretation of scriptures, and I like that. But what would you say would be like a central factor that you see, because this is all contextualized so very differently that it's really difficult to sort of decontextualize everything. But in general, would you say there is one thing that you think is most important for your study that women could use in order to break down certain barriers?
My response comes from both the yoginis that I studied, some of the theories that I used to understand their ritual, and also my own experience. So in my process, for not just this project, but for other projects, I was looking at some like cognitive semiotics, right, and how new meanings are made. And I think it was George Lakoff talked about it a lot, how, and especially in poetry and art, we have metaphor as like this primary vehicle where one thing means another thing. And what I see with these yoginis in particular is the appropriation of certain cultural symbols, right, that are normative, that everybody understands. And they use that, but they turn it just a little bit, right? So the example of Radhagiri, there's this notion of, yogini madness or ferocity. And to people who are living outside her circle of followers, they understand that as being a quality of the yogini, but it doesn't mean that she lacks control, and in fact it's instrumental, right? And so that's how she's using this to kind of reassert her Shakti or her power, to take a commonly used metaphor and give it some new life. And I think that just as being a woman, and not even just in like the spiritual world, but like in the academic world, I find that I might appropriate a certain notion of like what a scholarly woman is supposed to be like, and then turning it just a little bit so that I have a little bit more freedom, and in that process, hopefully transgressing some categories.
So if I would just add to that, that beautiful answer would be, in my studies, or where my area of concentration was, I think if women started to be a little more confident with their own interpretation and find authenticity in their own intellects. I mean, speaking only from my community and the experiences I've had with the interaction within my community, the women in my community, is that when things are authenticated by a male voice, do women find satisfaction in it? I know that as women exegetes, there is Banu Amin, who in 1960 published her 15-volume exegesis of the Qur'an. And there aren't many Muslim women who know of this. So I wish they would look for their, trust their intellect and authenticate it and build a community where they can take charge and they can be involved in the lawmaking process. They can be there guiding the norms of the culture. So I think that is what I would see women being involved in this method of getting to their text.
Please.
So, Mahjabeen, this goes to Laura and Mahjabeen in particular, because you're representing or speaking of traditions that are highly problematized within the secular academy, within the research academy. And Mahjabeen, you put it out there right at the beginning, okay? This situation, very clearly. So one of the points that I would want to ask you both to keep it to consider as you go forward with your work, both Laura and Mahjabeen, is that the area studies framework, the methodologies of area studies as it is applied to religions is highly problematic. Okay? It's not that it should not be studied regionally or globally. Of course it should. What I'm saying is it should not only be studied regionally or globally. So that you are a Shia woman here in Berkeley. That cannot be completely undermined. And Laura's work, she's a Hawaiian American. Her work cannot be undermined because neither of you are in some war zone or, in a village in a remote location. So the acceptance of your voice, even though it is coming from the West, even though it is coming from, quote, a privileged region, is something you will have to fight for. It's a caveat and an exhortation.
And hopefully an inspiration also.
Yes, most of the things that come out of her mouth either.
That's amazing. Any final questions? We have room for one more. Please.
I'm Joy Barnett. I'm actually a PSR MDiv several years ago. And one of my comments, it's not really a question, but it's an observation, is that all three of you touched on the fact that it's local interpretation of original text. And I'm just struck by how often we don't go to the original text and the variations that may have mutated through copying and inquire with our own experience and our own perspective, claiming the voice of here's how I interpret it and what I'm offering. So I heard that in all three of you and I commend that.
I think that's a lovely note on which to end. Let's go ahead and thank our panelists.
So thanks so much to Jen and to all the panelists, and we'll reconvene at 11, but